August 1944. Northern France. German field commanders watched. American supply convoys stretched to the horizon and laughed. Their own logistics doctrine proved that Patton's Third Army, now 400 miles from its supply bases and burning through 400,000 gallons of fuel per day, would grind to a halt within 2 weeks, handing Germany the perfect opportunity for a devastating counterattack. Instead, 6,000 trucks driven by soldiers America wouldn't even let eat in the same diners back home delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily, fueling the fastest Allied advance of the war and shattering every assumption the Wehrmacht had about how modern warfare worked. How did a convoy of supposedly second-class soldiers operating cast-off trucks unbombed out French roads accomplish what German high command calculated was logistically impossible? And why did it terrify them more than any weapon America had? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the summer of 1944, German officers stood in command posts across northern France and studied their maps with growing satisfaction. They had been soldiers long enough to know that wars were not won by brave charges or clever tactics alone. Wars were won by bread and bullets, by fuel and spare parts, by the unglamorous mathematics of supply lines. And right now, those mathematics were working in Germany's favor. The Allied armies had broken out of Normandy in early August, and American General George Patton was racing east across France faster than anyone thought possible. His Third Army was devouring the French countryside, town after town falling like dominoes. But the German commanders were not panicking. They were watching their calendars and doing simple arithmetic. Patton had started his advance from the beaches of Normandy, where American ships unloaded supplies at the port of Cherbourg. Now his tanks were 400 miles inland, and that distance was growing every single day. Colonel Friedrich Weber sat in a farmhouse outside of Nancy, smoking a cigarette and reviewing intelligence reports. He had served in the Wehrmacht for 20 years, and he understood logistics the way a fisherman understands tides. Every army in history had a maximum distance it could travel from its supply bases before it simply ran out of everything. The Romans knew it. Napoleon knew it. And Weber knew it. An army was like a man on a rope. You could run as fast as you wanted, but eventually the rope ran out and you fell. The numbers were clear, and they were damning for the Americans. Patton's Third Army had over 200,000 men. Those men needed food and water. They needed ammunition for their rifles and shells for their artillery. Most importantly, they needed fuel. Thousands of tanks and trucks, all drinking gasoline like thirsty horses. Weber's staff had calculated that Patton's army was burning through 400,000 gallons of fuel every single day. 400,000 gallons, and the nearest major supply port was back on the coast of France, connected by roads that Allied bombers had spent months destroying. Weber allowed himself a thin smile. The Americans were good fighters, he admitted that. They had machines and firepower that Germany could no longer match. But they were making a beginner's mistake, the same mistake that had killed better armies than theirs. They were racing ahead of their supply lines. In 2 weeks, maybe 3, Patton's tanks would roll to a stop with empty fuel tanks. His trucks would sit silent and useless. His men would be eating whatever they could find in French villages. And then the Wehrmacht would counterattack. Against an enemy that could not move and could not run. It was the same doctrine that had made the German Blitzkrieg so successful in the early years of the war. Move fast, hit hard, and live off captured enemy supplies. Keep your supply lines short. Never advance faster than your logistics could follow. The Americans, Weber thought, had forgotten these basic rules. They were drunk on their own success, charging forward without thinking about the cost. Other German officers shared Weber's confidence. In headquarters across France, they made the same calculations and reached the same conclusions. The maps told a story that could not be argued with. Cherbourg to Paris was 200 miles, and the Americans had captured that port only 6 weeks ago. Now Patton was pushing toward the German border, another 300 miles beyond Paris. The distance was simply too great. No army could maintain that pace. Physics and mathematics would not allow it. The German commanders had seen this pattern before. In 1941, their own panzer divisions had raced deep into Russia, and then ground to a halt when fuel trucks could not keep up. In 1942, Rommel's Afrika Korps had almost reached Cairo before supply problems stopped them cold. Distance was a weapon that could kill armies just as surely as bullets could. And right now, distance was on Germany's side. But in late August, something impossible started happening. Patton did not slow down. He did not pause to consolidate his supply lines. He did not stop to wait for fuel trucks to catch up. Instead, he accelerated. His tanks pushed faster and deeper into France. Towns that German planners expected to hold for weeks fell in days. Defensive positions that should have stopped the American advance were simply bypassed and left behind. Weber received new intelligence reports every morning, and each one made less sense than the last one. American forward units were not rationing fuel. They were not running out of ammunition. Reconnaissance planes reported seeing something that seemed impossible. Convoys of trucks, endless convoys, flowing east along the French roads like a river that never stopped. Hundreds of trucks, thousands of trucks, moving day and night in rain and sun, an unbroken chain of vehicles stretching back toward Normandy. Weber spread the aerial photographs across his desk and stared at them with growing unease. The trucks were painted with red circles, marking them as priority supply vehicles. They traveled in columns so long that the reconnaissance pilots could not see where they ended. Each truck carried fuel or ammunition or food, racing forward to feed Patton's advance. And behind each convoy came another convoy and another. Like ocean waves that never stopped breaking on the beach. This was not how logistics worked. This was not how any army in history had operated. Weber had studied supply operations for 2 decades, and he knew the limitations. Trucks broke down. Drivers needed rest. Roads became congested. Fuel had to be transported to fuel the trucks that transported fuel, creating a mathematical problem that eventually became impossible to solve. Every military academy in the world taught these basic facts, but the Americans were ignoring the rules. Or worse, they had somehow rewritten them. Weber stubbed out his cigarette and reached for another one, his hands not quite steady. For the first time since the Allies had landed in Normandy, he felt something that German officers rarely admitted to feeling. He felt doubtful. The convoys had a name: the Red Ball Express. Every truck that carried supplies for Patton's advance was painted with a red ball on its side. And those red balls meant one thing to everyone on the roads of France: get out of the way. Nothing had priority over the red ball trucks. Not generals and staff cars. Not ambulances. Not even other supply convoys. The red ball meant absolute priority, and the trucks rolled 24 hours a day without stopping. By September, 6,000 trucks were part of the Red Ball Express. They traveled on special routes that had been cleared just for them. The roads became one-way highways where trucks drove bumper to bumper at speeds that made French civilians cross themselves and pray. 40 miles per hour, 50 miles per hour, faster than supply trucks had ever moved in any war. The drivers had orders to maintain their speed no matter what. If a truck broke down, it was pushed to the side of the road and left behind. The convoy never stopped. German scouts hidden in the French countryside watched the convoys pass and reported back with numbers that their commanders refused to believe. 100 trucks in a convoy. 200 trucks. Some convoys stretched for 100 miles, a solid river of green vehicles flowing east like blood through an artery. At night, The scouts could hear them coming from miles away, the rumble of thousands of engines shaking the ground like distant thunder. During the day, the dust from their wheels rose so high that pilots could see the convoy routes from 10,000 feet in the air. What shocked the German observers more than the number of trucks was what those trucks carried. Of course, there was ammunition and fuel, the basic supplies that any army needed. But the trucks also carried things that seemed impossible to justify in the middle of a war. Cases of Coca-Cola, stacked 10 feet high. Cigarettes by the millions. Candy bars. Ice cream machines. Mail from home. Replacement uniforms. Spare parts for radios that most armies would have simply abandoned. The trucks carried everything, and they carried it all at once. As if America had decided to move an entire country across the ocean and deposit it in the middle of France. A captured German quartermaster was interrogated in late August, and the American intelligence officers asked him what surprised him most about Allied supply operations. The German officer sat in silence for a long time, choosing his words carefully. Finally, he said that in the Wehrmacht, a broken truck was a disaster because Germany could not build trucks fast enough to replace losses. But he had watched American units abandon trucks on the side of the road because fixing them would take too much time. They simply left them and requisitioned new ones. He said this in a quiet voice, like a man describing something he still could not quite believe. The trucks were driven primarily by black American soldiers. Men who wore the same uniform as white soldiers but were kept in separate units because the United States Army was still segregated in 1944. 3/4 of the Red Ball drivers were black men who had grown up in a country that would not let them vote in many states, would not let them eat in the same restaurants as white people, would not even let them use the same water fountains. But now those same men were given the most important job in the European theater of war. Keep Patton moving. Keep the fuel flowing. Win the war one truck at a time. The drivers worked shifts that would have been illegal in peacetime. 20 hours on, 4 hours off. Some drove for 36 hours straight, kept awake by Benzedrine pills that the army handed out like candy. They drove through rain and mud. They drove through German artillery fire. They drove on roads that German bombers had cratered, weaving between holes that could swallow a truck hole. Speed limits were ignored. Safety regulations were forgotten. The only rule that mattered was keep moving. At the forward fuel dumps near the front lines, American soldiers watched the convoys arrive and felt something close to awe. A fuel dump that would take a German supply unit 3 days to establish appeared overnight. Hundreds of barrels stacked in neat rows, guarded by a handful of military police. By morning it would be empty, drained by thirsty tanks and trucks, and by evening it would be full again. The fuel appeared as if by magic, except it was not magic at all. It was 6,000 trucks and 12,000 men who refused to sleep. German intelligence officers compiled reports on American logistics and sent them up the chain of command. But the reports seemed so exaggerated that many senior officers dismissed them as errors or propaganda. One report claimed that the Americans were delivering 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. 12,000 tons. That was more than some entire German army groups received in a week. Another report stated that a single American supply depot contained more spare parts than all of the Wehrmacht's repair facilities in France combined. These numbers seemed designed to damage German morale, so they were filed away and ignored. But frontline German troops knew the reports were true because they could see the results with their own eyes. American tanks that should have been out of fuel kept attacking. American artillery that should have been rationed kept firing. American infantry that should have been hungry kept advancing with pockets full of chocolate bars and cigarettes. The contrast was devastating. German soldiers were making belts tighter and sharing single cigarettes among 3 men. Their tanks sat silent because there was no fuel. Their trucks were pulled by horses because there were no spare tires. And across the battlefield, Americans were complaining about the flavor of their hot meals. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A Wehrmacht colonel named Hans Richter wrote in his diary that the Red Ball Express proved something terrible about the war. Germany had been fighting soldiers, but America was fighting with its factories, and factories could not be defeated by courage or tactics. He watched an American convoy pass through a town his unit had just evacuated, and he counted trucks until he reached 300 and then stopped counting because the convoy had no end. That night he wrote that Germany had declared war on a country that could afford to waste more resources than Germany could produce. He wrote that the war was already over. The only question was how long it would take for everyone else to realize it. In the first week of September 1944, senior Wehrmacht officers gathered in a command bunker east of Paris for a logistics briefing that would change how they understood the entire war. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of old coffee. Maps covered every wall, marked with red and blue lines showing German and American positions. But the maps that mattered most were the ones showing supply routes, fuel depots, and transportation networks. Those maps told a story that no German officer wanted to believe. General Otto Hartmann stood at the front of the room and presented numbers that his staff had verified 3 times because they seemed so impossible. The United States was producing 1 cargo truck every 90 seconds. Not every hour. Not every day. Every 90 seconds, a new truck rolled off an assembly line somewhere in America, ready to carry supplies to the front. In the time it took Hartmann to present his briefing, 40 new American trucks had been built. In a single day, America built almost 1,000 trucks. Germany's entire motor pool in France was barely larger than what America could build in 2 weeks. The officers in the room sat in stunned silence. Some took notes. Others simply stared at the numbers as if staring might make them change. One major raised his hand and asked if the intelligence might be wrong, if perhaps American propaganda had inflated the numbers to damage German morale. Hartmann shook his head slowly. The numbers came from multiple sources. From interrogated prisoners, from captured documents, from reconnaissance photographs of American factories. The numbers were real, and they were terrifying, but the trucks were only the beginning. Hartmann's staff had compiled reports on American industrial production across every category, and each number was worse than the last. America was producing more steel in a month than Germany produced in a year. American factories were turning out aircraft so fast that they had more planes than trained pilots to fly them. American shipyards were launching cargo ships faster than German submarines could sink them. One American shipyard had built a complete cargo vessel in 4 days and 15 hours. From the first steel plate to the launch ceremony, 4 days. German shipyards needed months to build ships half that size. A colonel in the back of the room asked the question that everyone was thinking. How were they supposed to fight an enemy with that kind of industrial power? How could tactics or training or fighting spirit overcome the simple mathematics of production? Germany had the most experienced soldiers in the world, veterans who had conquered Poland and France and most of Russia. But what did experience matter when the enemy could replace every destroyed tank with 3 new ones? What did skill matter when American factories could simply bury the Wehrmacht under mountains of equipment? Hartmann had no answer. None of them did. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years telling Germans that Americans were soft and lazy, obsessed with comfort and material wealth, lacking the discipline and strength that made German soldiers superior. But now that supposed weakness has become America's greatest weapon. The Americans were not just comfortable with mass production and industrial efficiency. They had turned it into a form of warfare that Germany could not counter. The reports included photographs from captured American supply dumps. and these photographs circulated among German officers like evidence of witchcraft. One dump contained 300,000 gallons of gasoline, just sitting in the open, guarded by a handful of soldiers. An entire panzer division could run for a month on that much fuel, and the Americans were storing it in the middle of France as if it had no value at all. Another photograph showed a field hospital stocked with more medical supplies than most German field hospitals had seen in the entire war. Plasma, morphine, bandages, antibiotics that German doctors had only read about in medical journals. But the moment that broke something in the German high command came when intelligence officers reported on American soldier rations. German troops were surviving on black bread and thin soup, supplemented with whatever they could scavenge. Meat was rare. Fresh vegetables were a memory. Cigarettes were divided into thirds so that 3 men could share one smoke. And the Americans? The Americans were eating 3 hot meals a day. They had chocolate bars in their pockets. They drank Coca-Cola at the front lines. Some units even had ice cream, delivered by special trucks that kept it frozen while driving through the August heat. A Wehrmacht logistics officer named Klaus Becker wrote a report that was marked classified and sent directly to Berlin. In it, he calculated that the Americans were wasting more supplies than Germany was producing. Not using. Food thrown away because it was not fresh enough. Equipment abandoned because repairs would take too much time. Fuel spilled carelessly because there was always more coming. Becker wrote that this wastefulness was not a weakness. It was proof of strength so overwhelming that Germany could not compete with it. A poor man counts every coin. A rich man does not notice when coins fall from his pocket. America was so rich in industrial capacity that it could afford to be wasteful. And that wastefulness was winning the war. The ideological foundation that had sustained the Wehrmacht began to crack. German soldiers had been taught that they were fighting for their homeland, against inferior enemies who lacked German discipline and courage. They had been told that 1 German soldier was worth 10 American soldiers. But those lessons had been written for a different kind of war, a war where both sides had similar resources and the better fighters would win. This was not that war. This was a war where one side could lose 10 tanks and replace them by morning, while the other side lost 1 tank and could never replace it. In quiet conversations in officers' messes and command posts across France, German leaders began to speak the truth that propaganda had hidden. They had not been fighting the American army. They had been fighting American industry, and that was a battle Germany had lost before the first shot was ever fired. The Red Ball Express was not clever tactics or brilliant strategy. It was simply America doing what America did best, producing and moving and supplying on a scale that seemed to violate the basic rules of war. The Wehrmacht had brought rifles to a fight against factories, and factories did not get tired, or run out of ammunition or retreat when attacked. General, whose name was redacted from captured documents, wrote in his diary that watching the Red Ball convoys pass had taught him something he wished he had never learned. Germany had started a war against an enemy that could afford to care about whether its soldiers had hot coffee with breakfast. Any nation with that much power to spare was unbeatable. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and German officers who had spent years studying maps and moving armies suddenly found themselves prisoners studying a different kind of lesson. They were sent to camps in France and Britain and America, and there they had time to think about what had defeated them. In the quiet hours between roll calls and mealtimes, they wrote letters and kept diaries and talked among themselves about the war they had lost. And again, their thoughts returned to the same subject. The trucks. Those endless American trucks with red balls painted on their sides. Colonel Friedrich Weber, who had once calculated that Patton would run out of fuel in 2 weeks, sat in a British prisoner of war camp and wrote a letter to his wife in Hamburg. He told her that he had finally understood why Germany lost the war, and it had nothing to do with brave soldiers or clever generals. Germany lost because it had started a fight with a country that made war the way other countries made bread, easily, constantly, with enough left over to feed the neighbors. He wrote that the Americans had not just defeated the Wehrmacht. They had made German military doctrine look like something from the previous century, outdated and quaint and useless. After the war ended, the American military began a series of studies trying to understand what had made their victory possible. They interviewed German officers, asking them to analyze American tactics and strategy. The answers surprised the American researchers because the Germans rarely talked about battles or weapons. Instead, they talked about logistics. They talked about the Red Ball Express. They talked about supply dumps that appeared overnight and convoys that never stopped moving. A captured Wehrmacht general told his interrogators that Germany's biggest mistake was not understanding that modern war was won in factories and lost on assembly lines. He said the Blitzkrieg had worked against Poland and France because those countries had similar industrial capacity to Germany. But against America, Blitzkrieg was like trying to empty an ocean with a bucket. The numbers from the Red Ball Express became part of military history, studied in war colleges around the world. Between August and November 1944, the Red Ball convoys had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. They had driven more than 140 million miles, enough to circle the Earth 5,000 times. They had kept Patton's army moving when every law of military logistics said movement should have been impossible. And they had done it with trucks that were not even the best trucks America could build, driven by men who were considered second-class citizens in their own country. German military analysts in the post-war years wrote extensively about what they called the American way of war. It was different from European military traditions that emphasized tactics and training and fighting spirit. The American way of war was based on overwhelming material superiority. Produce more tanks than the enemy can destroy. Deliver more supplies than the enemy can intercept. Replace losses faster than they can accumulate. It was not elegant or clever, but it worked with a brutal efficiency that made traditional military thinking obsolete. One German military historian wrote that America had discovered how to turn capitalism into a weapon, and that weapon had crushed Germany like a hammer crushing an egg. In 1948, the United States announced the Marshall Plan, a program to rebuild Europe by sending billions of dollars in aid. German officials who had fought against America just 3 years earlier now found themselves receiving American help. Factories were rebuilt with American money. Food arrived on American ships. Coal and steel and machinery flowed from America to Germany in quantities that seemed impossible. And the Germans who remembered the Red Ball Express saw the connection immediately. America was using the same system that had won the war to rebuild the countries it had defeated. The logistics that had brought fuel to Patton's tanks were now bringing food to German children. The industrial power that had buried the Wehrmacht was now lifting Germany out of poverty. Former Wehrmacht logistics officers found work consulting for the new West German military and for NATO, teaching the lessons they had learned the hard way. They emphasized that modern armies needed to think about supply lines before they thought about anything else. They taught that mobility without logistics was suicide. They used the Red Ball Express as an example in every lesson, showing how America had solved problems that German military doctrine said could not be solved. Some of these officers admitted privately that it was humbling to teach German soldiers to fight the way Americans fought. But they did it anyway because they knew the old ways did not work anymore. The Red Ball Express drivers themselves, those 12,000 men who had worked 20-hour shifts and driven through artillery fire to keep Patton moving, came home to an America that had not changed as much as they hoped. They had proven themselves under conditions that would have broken most men. They had done work that military historians would study for generations. But they came home to the same segregated country they had left. The same laws that said where they could eat and sleep and work. The same system that treated them as lesser citizens, despite the uniforms they had worn and the job they had done. But something had changed, even if it was not visible yet. The Red Ball drivers had proven something that racist propaganda said was impossible. They had shown that black soldiers could be trusted with the most important mission in the European theater. They had demonstrated competence and courage under conditions that demanded both. And that proof, that undeniable record of achievement, became part of the evidence that would eventually help dismantle segregation in the American military and in American society. It took years, longer than it should have. But the change came in part because of what those drivers had done on the roads of France in 1944. The term Red Ball became military slang that lasted long after the convoys themselves were disbanded. Even today, when the American military needs to move supplies urgently, they call it Red Ball priority. The name honors those convoys and the men who drove them, even if most people who use the term do not know its history. Military logistics planners still study the Red Ball Express as an example of what is possible when you combine clear priorities with relentless execution. Every NATO operation, every American military deployment, every modern supply chain includes lessons learned from those 6,000 trucks rolling through France 80 years ago. German military memoirs from the post-war period return again and again to a single theme. The Wehrmacht had been good at war, experienced, disciplined, tactically superior in many battles. But being good at war was not enough when the enemy was good at production. The Americans had not beaten Germany by fighting better. They had beaten Germany by making more, moving more, and supplying more than any army in history. The Red Ball Express was proof that logistics, the unglamorous science of moving things from one place to another, could be more powerful than courage or skill or tactics. One retired German general, speaking at a military conference in 1963, was asked what lesson he had learned from fighting the Americans. He thought for a long moment and then said that he had learned to respect the men who drove trucks as much as the men who drove tanks. He said that in the German military, logistics officers were considered less important than combat officers, and support troops less impressive than frontline troops. But the Americans had understood something Germany missed. In modern war, the supply convoy is just as important as the armored division. Maybe more important. Because without supplies, the tanks do not move and the soldiers do not fight, and the war is already lost. The Red Ball Express had delivered 90 million gallons of fuel to Patton's Third Army between August and November 1944. 90 million gallons. That single number contained the entire story of why Germany lost the war. Not because German soldiers were not brave, not because German generals were not skilled, but because America could produce and move 90 million gallons of fuel while simultaneously fighting wars on 2 continents and feeding its own population and building ships and planes faster than they could be destroyed. That was the real weapon, not tanks or artillery or aircraft. The weapon was an economy so powerful that it could fight a total war and still have resources left over for ice cream and Coca-Cola and hot meals at the front. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is written in every modern military textbook, in every logistics manual, in every supply operation. It proved that wars are not won by the side that fights hardest, but by the side that can sustain the fight longest. It showed that industrial capacity is military capacity, and that factories are as important as fortresses. And it demonstrated that the supposedly boring work of moving supplies from point A to point B can change the course of history more decisively than any battle ever fought. The German commanders who had laughed at American supply lines learned that lesson too late to save themselves. But their defeat taught it to everyone who came after. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.